Throughout the harrowing years of the Vietnam War, the vast majority of combat operations launched by the United States Armed Forces against the Viet Cong insurgents and the North Vietnamese Army unfolded within the suffocating depths of the jungle. As a core component of the South Vietnam Pacification Program, General William Westmoreland, the commander of the U.S. Army during this conflict, implemented the aggressive search and destroy tactic. This strategy necessitated reconnaissance patrols pushing deep into territory held by the insurgents, with the specific objective of locating and neutralizing enemy strongholds. For the American soldiers and their allies, these missions were fraught with extreme peril. Not only were they patrolling far from the safety of their bases, but they were also constantly vulnerable to ambushes from an enemy that remained expertly concealed and far better adapted to the brutal conditions of the tropical environment. However, among all the dangers of the brush, the most haunting and terrifying threat to these patrolling units was the booby trap. These hidden killers became one of the most infamous hallmarks of the Vietnam War, serving as a fundamental pillar of the military strategy employed by both the Viet Cong and the NVA. They were utilized with such frequency that they functioned as both defensive barriers and offensive weapons. Over time, the Viet Cong and NVA soldiers evolved into master craftsmen of these lethal contraptions, which were responsible for a staggering number of American casualties. These traps were remarkably effective, despite their primitive nature and the fact that they were constructed from common, readily available materials like bamboo, iron, mud, and coconuts. These devices were strategically deployed to stall and demoralize American forces and their allies. Often, the mere threat of a booby trap was enough to reduce a rapid advance to a snail's pace, forcing commanders to divert precious resources toward guard duty and tedious clearance operations. Beyond inflicting physical wounds and destroying equipment, these traps were nearly impossible to spot when properly camouflaged, especially by soldiers who were physically and mentally drained by long, grueling patrols. Furthermore, these traps were frequently overseen by hidden snipers waiting to initiate an ambush the moment a device was triggered. Beyond the physical lethality, these traps were designed to sow psychological terror among the ranks. The pervasive fear of stepping into a hidden grave kept field units under a state of perpetual stress, leading to profound mental exhaustion for both the officers in charge and the soldiers on the ground. Among the most common of these hazards were the Punji stakes. Punji traps typically consisted of long, sharpened steel rods or bamboo nails driven through blocks of wood. These spiked assemblies were hammered into the bottom of a wooden box, which was then buried in a shallow pit or submerged within a rice paddy. The top of the box was meticulously hidden under a thin frame covered with grass, crops, leaves, and mud for camouflage. When an unsuspecting soldier on patrol stepped onto the surface, his leg would plunge through the frame and onto the jagged stakes below. Once the limb was impaled, it was virtually impossible to extract it without causing catastrophic tissue damage. To make matters worse, these spikes were often intentionally coated with human excrement, urine, or various poisons to ensure that even a non-fatal wound would result in a severe, life-threatening infection. While small punji traps were roughly 16 inches wide and 23 inches deep, there was also a much larger, more elaborate version of this design. This massive pit was filled with sharpened bamboo stakes protruding in multiple directions to maximize injury. The top of this larger trap featured a bamboo frame and cover, camouflaged with mud and foliage, which was balanced on a central axle. If a soldier stepped onto one side of the cover, he would tumble into the abyss, and the weighted cover would rotate back to its original position on the axle, hiding the evidence and waiting for the next victim. During periods of ceasefire, the insurgents would often secure these covers with a bamboo crossbeam to prevent accidental triggers. These were the most fundamental designs for punji stake traps, and they were strategically placed wherever the enemy was likely to move with force. Common locations included the banks of streams, helicopter landing zones, or areas where soldiers might instinctively seek cover during a firefight, such as inside ditches, behind fallen logs, or within patches of tall grass. Another lethal variation was the spike board, which utilized a simple but deadly mechanical principle. This trap consisted of a treadle board where one end was heavily laden with spikes. If a soldier stepped on the trigger end of the treadle, The opposite side would swing upward with incredible force, driving the spikes directly into his face or chest. The chances of surviving such a direct hit were incredibly slim. Similarly, the trap bridge was a deceptive hazard usually constructed over a ditch filled with mud or water. Beneath the surface lay a bed of sharpened bamboo sticks, cut low enough so they remained hidden beneath the waterline. If the water level was low, the ditch was often blocked to keep the sticks submerged, or they were simply coated in mud to blend in. The structural integrity of the bridge was intentionally compromised. The middle was partially sawn through so that it would collapse under the weight of crossing soldiers. When the wood snapped, everyone on the bridge would be dropped onto the waiting spikes below. These bridges were specifically designed to slow down the momentum of search and clearing operations. The Venus flytrap offered another variation of the box trap. In this design, the spikes were not located at the bottom, but were instead attached to the sides, overlapping and pointing downward. The primary injury wouldn't occur when the soldier's foot first entered the box, but rather when he attempted to pull it back out, as the downward angled spikes would bite deep into the flesh. For more lateral attacks, the side-closing trap was used. This device featured two wooden slats armed with spikes, held apart by a prop and tensioned with heavy rubber bands along iron guide rods. When a soldier tripped the mechanism by knocking away the prop, the slats would slam together with violent force, impaling the victim's torso. The bear trap was another form of side-closing device, though smaller in scale. It consisted of two spiked wooden boards hinged at one end so they would pivot upward. These were hidden in shallow, camouflaged holes, and when stepped upon, the boards would snap upward to strike the victim's leg above the foot. This was a traditional design adapted from local methods used for hunting bears. For attacks from above, the insurgents utilized the tiger trap. This hunting-style trap involved a large, heavy board studded with spikes and weighted down with stones and bricks, suspended in the canopy of a tree over a trail. It was linked to a tripwire. Once triggered by a passing soldier, the board would be released to plummet downward, crushing and impaling anyone standing beneath it. A similar concept was found in the mace trap, though instead of falling straight down, it functioned as a swinging pendulum. The mace itself could be a concrete sphere, a spiked ball of mud, a wooden box, or most commonly, a heavy log bristling with metal spikes. These traps were exceptionally heavy and were suspended from trees by ropes or cables. When a soldier hit the tripwire on the path, the mace would swing through a wide arc, impaling and knocking down multiple soldiers at once. Because of its ability to cause mass casualties in a single strike, it was one of the most feared booby traps of the entire war. This danger extended into urban or residential settings as well. Door traps were essentially miniature versions of these swinging traps, scaled down to fit inside a house. Suspended over a doorway, the trap was linked to the door itself. When a soldier pushed the door open, he would release a tripwire that sent a spiked bamboo pole or a small log swinging into his chest. The bamboo whip trap was another distinctive and powerful weapon in the Viet Cong arsenal. This involved a long bamboo pole that was bent into a high-tension arch and held in place by a catch connected to a tripwire. When the wire was snagged, the catch would release, and the bamboo pole would snap back to its original straight position with immense speed, striking the victim in the legs or torso. These could be set at various heights and were sometimes fitted with spikes to increase the lethality, though the sheer force of the bamboo alone was often enough to cause internal injuries. Beyond mechanical devices, the Viet Cong also employed biological booby traps, specifically snake pits. American soldiers held a deep-seated fear of these animal-based traps. Insurgents would often hide venomous bamboo green pit vipers inside their backpacks. If an American soldier searched the bag, he would be bitten. These same vipers were frequently tied to bamboo sticks inside the vast network of rat tunnels. If a tunnel rat moved the stick, the snake would fall and strike. Vipers were even tied to tree branches at face level along jungle paths. After being left for days without food, these snakes became incredibly aggressive, striking at anything that moved nearby. Though their lethality was sometimes exaggerated, American troops nicknamed them two-step snakes, believing a victim could only take 2 steps before collapsing. A less lethal but equally disruptive tactic was the hornet trap. Hives of aggressive hornets or bees were positioned along patrol routes and covered with paper attached to a tripwire. When triggered, the insects would swarm the soldiers. Often, these were placed near Punji traps. The resulting panic would cause soldiers to dive off the path for cover, landing directly on hidden spikes. Perhaps the most sophisticated non-explosive device was the arrow trap. This consisted of a wooden board with a 3-foot bamboo tube mounted to it. Inside the tube was an arrow powered by a heavy-duty rubber band held back by a catch. A tripwire stretched across the trail was linked to this catch. These traps were positioned at specific angles and distances so that when a soldier hit the wire, the arrow would be launched directly into his torso. Because these traps were a danger to everyone, including the insurgents themselves, the Viet Cong created a complex system of booby trap markers. By learning to read these subtle signs, they could navigate safely around their own lethal creations. These markers were incredibly varied and difficult for outsiders to decipher. They might consist of sticks laid in specific patterns, forked branches, folded palm leaves, or even broken twigs. Standard markers included bamboo tripods or rectangles laid on the forest floor. However, even though some were relatively large, they were nearly impossible for exhausted American soldiers to notice. On long, draining marches through the heat, the situational awareness of the troops would plummet, making them easy prey for these silent, deadly traps hidden in the shadows of the jungle. If this exploration of the hidden lethality of the jungle has changed the way you look at the history of warfare, then join our ranks by subscribing and liking the video. We are dedicated to unearthing the dark chapters of history that time has tried to bury. Help us grow the future of historical discovery. The next vault of secrets will be opened very soon.